Good morning. Please turn with me to Proverbs, the 15th chapter. Proverbs, the 15th chapter, beginning at verse 1, which I know is a little unusual, but it seems to set an interesting context for what we'll be looking at in Job this morning as we look at the subject, a soft answer. Because I'm famous for speaking softly, right? No, not so much. But that's what the verse is talking about in Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1, where it says, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. And again, something similar in verse 4, where it says, a gentle tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit, which is exactly what we seem to be dealing with as we turn back to Job chapter 8. As Job is now dealing with the responses from two new friends in this week's reading. The first is Bildad in chapter 8, and in chapter 11, it's going to be a friend by the name of Zophar. And the first two verses of Proverbs 15 seem to literally describe the way in which they are able to direct Job's mood. Why? Because Bildad, even though he is going to start out really blunt, one of the things we noticed is that it's not just a soft answer that can turn away wrath. Sometimes, even if a word is stated bluntly, but it's fair, depending upon the ear of the hearer, it can still have the tendency to de-escalate potential conflict. And so what we're going to notice in Bildad is, and this is going to be in your own personal time, because we're not going to really settle into Bildad's lessons, but it's more or less after we pass chapter 8. His first few words are going to be pretty harsh. Why? Because verses 1 and 2. Then Bildad the Shuhite answered and said, how long will you say these things and the words of your mouth be a great wind? Does God pervert justice, or does the Almighty pervert the right? If your children have sinned against him, he has delivered them into the hand of their transgression. How does that tone down anger, Marcus? Like we said, he's going at his kids, and they aren't here to defend themselves. But what he does is he states it in a more open perspective. He simply tells Job, as we mentioned on Wednesday in some of the classes, he's telling them truths he already knows, even if they are harsh truths. And the great thing that we notice about Job is even though he starts out, meaning Bildad starts out, pointing his discussion at Job, he opens it up to talk about general principles of life that aren't all that untrue. And it's easy to get lost in the fact that these three friends in the end end up being rebuked by God. But within that, they give us a lot of healthy life lessons. Understanding that sometimes the bad guys are nuanced, right? And sometimes that's one of the reasons why it's not healthy to look at life in terms of good guys and bad guys. Because as we talked about in class and as we talk about from time to time, I learned one thing if all I can do is identify with Job and fail to realize I've never suffered that much. But don't we always want to try to identify with the quote-unquote good guy? But I learn a whole lot more if I understand the nuanced ways in which Bildad and Eliphaz and Zophar are discouraging. Oh, because guess what? As we mentioned, sometimes my words are discouraging too. And so in Bildad, what I get a chance to see is someone who does not speak perfectly, but he is still able to redirect Job's perspective back towards God. We mentioned it in class. Even if my friends are imperfect in my time of need, to the degree that they can redirect my attention to the actual issue that needs to be resolved, they are still helping me, even if they aren't helping in the way that I want. And that's exactly what happens. Why? Because when Job responds in chapters 9 and 10, he is going to use the word you. And this is a discussion that really can be seen in a simple word, you. Because most of the yous that Job is going to use are not directed at Bildad. They're directed at God. And so that gives you an indication that no matter how harsh Bildad has been, the truth in what he has said has helped Job refocus on trying to understand the best way out of this seemingly hopeless situation. And so even in his imperfection, he has still helped to redirect Job in a healthy direction. Oh, but if it could have stayed there, that would be great. But in life, there are times when the difficulty is made worse by the fact that it ebbs and flows in ways that I can neither predict nor, oh God, well, I'd love to be able to control it, right? Like we said, I love holding on to the high points in life, even when God has told me it's time to move on. See, I'm not always ready to move on. And that's what the second half of Proverbs chapter 15 talks about. But a harsh word stirs up anger. And that's what we're going to see out of Zophar when he starts his rebuke of Job in chapter 11. Most of what Zophar says is really unoriginal. He's actually simply repeating, ironically enough, not only things that his two friends have said before him, but he's even repeating stuff that Job has said. Not in any clever turn of phrase. He's really just regurgitating what Job has already said his difficulty is. And so with that, he is adding to it some new things, and the new things that he's adding are actually pretty sharp comments that are directed personally at Job, or at least they seem to be. Verse 6, back up to verse 5 of chapter 11. But oh, that God would speak and open his lips to you, and that he would tell you the secrets of wisdom, for he is manifold in understanding. Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. Going back to that question that Job posed already that they're not answering, they're skirting around it. What guilt, buddy? What did I do? And that's the thing that all three friends are missing. No matter how they might actually hit on portions of the truth, the one truth that they can't really get to is a clear statement of what it is that Job has actually done. And so Zophar is multiplying words. Kind of like God's going to come in at the end and say, who is this who multiplies words? Or was it? Yeah, I'd have to quote it. I don't remember. But multiplies words without wisdom. Something similar. That's essentially what Job's friends are doing here. They're using a lot of words that never address the central point. You think Job is guilty, but you don't know what he's done. And so in addition to saying telling Job that he deserves much worse than he's getting, down in verse 20, he's going to be a little more indirect in saying, but the eyes of the wicked will fail. After I should set a little context, in verses 13 through 19, he's going to basically end his statement the same way all Job's friends have. Job, if you do well, God will treat you good. That's a little bit more complicated than that, and God is actually going to clear that up towards the end. But until then, that's what they're realizing. That's how they are reasoning. It had to go back to something that Job did. But it's, like we said, a little bit more complicated than that. Because at the end, that's the basis of his reasoning when he's saying, let me slow down. From verses 13 through 19, that Job, if you just turn it around, God will turn it around for you. But he's going to add at the end, verse 20, but the eyes of the wicked will fail. All way of escape will be lost to them, and their hope is to breathe their last. And that would be it's still false, an interesting thing to say if it wasn't coming on the heels of Job over and over and over again saying that he wants to die. And so what Zophar is essentially doing here is basically saying, the only way out that the wicked have is wanting to die. That's it. Well, he might not have known a man as we mentioned before, by the name of Elijah, who was pretty righteous, but he still kind of wanted to go. Might not have been, by this time, he should have known, maybe, we don't know, of Moses, who was pretty righteous, but still wanted to go. And he probably couldn't have known of Paul, but the point is something we've talked about a little bit here and there, and that is the less famous side of Psalm 19, which simply says, Lord, keep me back from presumptuous sins. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. And understand the problem that Zophar has stepped into, that he has gone probably a little bit further than some of the other friends in making obvious, is that he is reasoning life from a very limited experience. When we talked about in classes, there was a time when I was working with some college kids. They were college athletes or prospective college athletes because there was a program that the NCAA had started up before the young people had to go at least for a year of college. I don't think they have to do that anymore, but there was a time when they had to go for at least a year of college, even if they had the talent to go to the NBA right away. The NCAA was running a program where they were trying to convince the kids to at least try a year of college instead of going straight to the NBA if they could. And one of the young men was from New York, and I thought he was asking just a getting to know you question of the old guy who was there working with the college athletes. And he was like, where you from, sir? I was like, he was like, country. I was like, Houston, the city. But to him, if you didn't live in New York, you were country. And so I use that to say that in life, there are times when it's good to love where you're from. But whether it is big city New York or right on here in Pullman, Moscow, or wherever, we all got a set of advantages and disadvantages to where we live. And we step into the realm of presumptuous sins when we make too much of our starting point, when we are too proud of New York not being as country as Houston, or fill in the blank with what you love about where you started. Because the problem that we're seeing with making too much of our starting point is being made absolutely clear in what Zophar is doing here. In his experience, the wicked are the ones who want to die. But God is helping us see that a man who is more righteous than he is suffering things that make him want to check out right now. And it's one thing for me to have a limited experience. It's another thing, as the Bible says, to make too much of my experience and then make long-lasting implications about eternal truths based upon how I grew up in Houston, or how my friend grew up in New York, or how fill in the blank with the starting point. That's the mistake that Zophar is making. We can't fault him for having a limited experience. Guess who else has that? Everybody raise your hand, right? You don't have to. We all got a limited experience. That's the thing we have in common. And that is one of the reasons why when Jesus gets to us in the Sermon on the Mount, it's the context of our limited experience in which he is saying, judge not lest, because we simply don't have the perspective to preach eternal truths from our starting point. Oh, when we learn so much more when we allow our experiences to open us up to what God might be doing based upon what we've seen him do before. Because that's the thing that Job has in common with all of his friends. They are trying to understand where God is moving, too stuck in an understanding of all the things he's already done. And that's why they're spending roughly 30-something chapters spinning around the same nucleus, because they don't realize that God has moved off into another place in what he's doing. One of the advantages we talked about in class, and we talked about in the short lesson called, what was it called? Exactly. Exposure. Exposure. Talking about how I, as a civilian, I grew up like a boy in Houston, Texas. We like guns and whatnot. We like war movies. We watch war movies, and that's where pretty much that's the extent of my understanding. I've never been enlisted. I've never served. But one of the interesting things that I would like to be true, because I thought it was just that interesting, is the way in which there are some high-tech ways to expose an enemy's positions, but then there are just some old-fashioned ways where if you're going to find out where they're shooting from, somebody got to get shot at. And the problem is that if you got somebody who's really easy to shoot, they're not going to show you very much of what the enemy has in store for you. Oh, but if you got somebody who's skilled at getting out there and exposing the enemy's positions, unfortunately, they are typically the one who's going to be more qualified for that very unfavorable job that probably nobody wants to do. Drawing out and exposing the enemy's positions of where they're fighting from. And in a lot of ways that I can't say that is part of what God is doing here, but that's what we talked about in the short. Job's helping to us to see more than one thing. One, we're getting to see what it looks like when Satan has the gloves off. How do we know? Because in the beginning discussion between God and Satan, he's like, you got this hedge of protection around him. Of course he's happy and he loves you, right? But once the hedge of protection is off, we get to see Satan with his gloves off. Still a little limited, right? Because he doesn't get to tamper with Job's physical health. Oh, but then the gloves come off with everything except his life. And now we get to see how the enemy acts up when he don't have God there getting in his way. More importantly, we're getting a chance to see exactly all of the different ways he continues, as our brother noticed in class, to have mileage in our lives, even after Satan is not everywhere. He is not omnipresent. It does not describe him as being like the Holy Spirit, indwelling the believers. No, he moves around and he has a limited experience, but he often gets too much mileage out of the people he leaves behind. And that is one of the reasons why it is so important to understand the book of Job, not just from Job's perspective, but understanding the ways in which he uses me as an imperfect friend to continue to add pressure when he is long gone, to continue to add mileage to the kinds of things he would like or the ways he would like to provoke a person if he simply had the time to stick around. And so that's what we're seeing here. And so in this accusation, or these two accusations out of Zophar, that God is exacting less of you than your guilt deserves, and the eyes of the wicked will fail, and their only hope is death. Job, so what are you doing crying for death? What does that mean? Are you guilty? Well, you must be guilty. You must be wicked, Job. Satan's still getting mileage even though we don't see him still around. How do we know? Well, Job's response to Zophar, if you just look at the titles, I don't know what your subject headings are, but it's going to be just Job in verse 12 replies, the Lord has done this. In chapter 13, Job continues, still I would hope in God. And my subject heading in chapter 14 says, Job continues, Death comes soon to all. But within that, the difference that we are going to see in his response to Zophar is the use in, especially chapters 12 and 13, they aren't directed as God exclusively. He's going to take a pause to turn some of his attention directly to Zophar. How do we know? Verse 1 of chapter 12 gets us started that way. Then Job answered and said, no doubt you are the people, and wisdom will die with you. I'm picking up a little sarcasm in that one, right? Once you guys pass, assuredly we will not be able to find our way. But he's going to continue on. But I have understanding as well as you, and I'm not inferior to you. Who does not know such things as these? Once again, might not be sarcasm. It's like you're not saying anything we don't already know, bud. I am a laughing stock to my friends. Who called to God and he answered me. A just and blameless man am a laughing stock. And understand, we reference this as well. Part of what is happening when our words are inaccurate. It's one thing, like we said, to do what Bildad does, to state it in the form of an if. This could mean this, Job, or this could mean that. But when we turn maybes into condemnation, then we have a tendency to provoke people into places where they feel the need to defend themselves. And in defending himself, what God is literally going to rebuke Job for toward the end, and what Elihu is going to pick up on before God even speaks, is Job is going a little bit too far on being blameless. It's another proverb that says, let another praise you. Don't let it come out of the words. Don't be too eager to pat yourself on the back. And Job ordinarily wouldn't have done this. So we can't fault him because he doesn't start doing a whole lot of it. I mean, he's talked about it before, but it seems like it's a little bit more prominent when Eliphaz and Zophar are doing the provoking. Why? Because as we said before, if you look at the yous that Job uses in responding to Bildad, a lot of those yous are directed at God. Help me understand, Lord. Just help me reason. And if there is some guilt in me, that's the good qualification to this whole concept of him calling himself blameless. He's calling himself blameless, but he's not calling himself sinless. How do you know? Skip to 14. Skip to 14 for me, please. Verse 16. He's talking about, God, please just hide me in Sheol. Right? It's another reference to death. Until your anger passes. But in verse 16, he's going to say, for then you would number my steps and would not keep watch over my sin. My transgression would be sealed up in a bag, and you would cover over my iniquity. So he's not saying he's sinless. He's going through all the different versions. That's pretty much it. We talked about the difference between sin, transgression, and iniquity. Not going to beat the dead horse again, but sin is that thing that's typically associated with when you are literally trying to hit the mark. You're trying to do the right thing, and you just miss. It's like being a bad shot. Transgression is a little bit different. It's my brother has a boundary. He's got property. I haven't been invited. But I decide I'm not only going to welcome myself over, but I'm going to go take some stuff. That's transgression. And iniquity is me deciding that this is the kind of lifestyle I'm going to live. I know I shouldn't have gone over there, but I don't see them. They don't have a fence either. And since I didn't have any problems going to get their stuff, I'm going to go get theirs and theirs and theirs. And I heard that, there's this thing called consequences. Well, they ain't caught up yet, so why bother? Iniquity is me getting in that pattern of doing stuff. And Job is using those terms to describe all the different ways, even though he considers himself a blameless man. It's not like I never sinned. There might be something that is going on. These guys might be right in at least one respect, right? And so I'm not saying that God is unfair to the point where I am a sinless human being. There's nothing I've ever done wrong. He's just saying, I don't get it. And help me understand. But the problem is Zophar has redirected him back to defending himself. And so now he's going back away from that part of Job that says, yes, even though I don't know what I've done wrong, I know that I'm a flawed individual. And now he's back into overdoing it and defending himself. Why? It's a natural response. Oh, we talked this morning, me and brother John. We talked about that whole concept of sometimes I do some stuff that's wrong, and I think, what were my motives when I did that? And sometimes I get in the habit of, it's one thing to do self-examination, but like we said, sometimes I'm a little too harsh on myself. There's times when I'm not harsh enough, but there's sometimes when I really just did a thing because I was happy, not because I was trying to rub it in, or this and this and that. We talked about that this morning, right? Sometimes I'm just really happy that I'm finding relief in a certain place. And with Job, he is in a situation where he is now finding his words, whatever he says, they are evidence that it's evidence that can and will be used against him in the next statement from his friends. Because even if he's just speaking out of his pain, they are not giving him a whole lot of leeway. or compassion for the situation that he is in. Understanding that it doesn't seem like he was the kind of man that really spent a whole lot of time patting himself on the back before he basically began to lose everything. And so he is one who, under pressure, we're starting to see some of the things that, like I think I've said in passing, if we look this good in our time of distress, we might be doing real good. I think Job's holding up pretty well. But the bottom line is he's now in chapters 12, 13, and 14, being driven back to a place where now he has turned his attention from trying to understand, or get a better understanding of what's going wrong, to now he's just angry and he's lashing out at his friends again. Skip down to verse 7 for me as he continues responding to Zophar. But ask the beasts, and they will tell you, the birds of the heaven, and they will tell you, and the bushes of the earth, and they will teach you. The fish of the sea will declare it to you. Like he's saying, look, buddy, not only are you saying things that are unoriginal, you're telling me things that nature itself. He's literally saying the animals can teach you this, but tell me something new. God is in control of these things. But Job is going to go too far. Why is he going to go too far? Because in verse 9, he's going to say, who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? It's not the hand of the Lord, Job. He's put you into the hand of Satan, right? And it's a famous lesson. Sometimes I try to avoid all the things I think you've heard before, but sometimes we just need to hear them again. Because it's the simple things that get lost in pain. Ronnie Lott, an old football player who was notorious for being brutal on the field when he was approaching the end of his career, he's like, I don't have to pretend to be tough anymore. One of the things with pain, I had to learn to overcome it. Because you look at me as being courageous, but pain turns men into cowards, brother. And it makes us reach all new lows that we might not have realized when we were in a position of relative comfort. And so that is what we are seeing here. It is important for us to remember that some of those simple lessons that we've heard from Job from the time we were yay high are still the ones that we don't want to lose. And even though you might love God seated here in the pews, life can take us all to some places where we will begin to see things fall away in a manner in which we will begin to question whether or not it is actually God doing to us. Even though we've known Job lived this whole experience, so we never have to question that again. Get back to me next time you're going through pain. Get back to me next time you're going through pain, right? And it won't be quite as easy to remember the simple things when you're going through pain. It's one of the reasons why when they're training, you did it this morning, brother, it's your fault. You started out with a sports analogy, so I get one. Okay, maybe I don't. It's why when they're testing athletes, one of the things that you can see in exceptionally skilled athletes is their ability to answer questions while they're doing physically demanding things. Because it's one thing to simply just beat up a heavy bag. It's another thing to just put up a whole bunch of jump shots. But it's another thing to do all that when people are trying to hit you and shoot you and do all those. Oh, that's why I think they have live. They don't have any live fire drills in the military. No, that's a waste of ammunition. It'd be a waste of ammunition if you didn't need to see how people respond under fire. And that's the difference. Things that are ordinarily simple become a whole lot more different under fire, right? And so that is one of those original lessons from early on Bible school that we don't need to lose track of. Why? Because they're a whole lot easier to apply as opposed to understanding once the pain starts all over again. But understand, it's not just Zophar. Bildad is also going to make some mistakes. And one thing I should probably mention before I move on to Bildad is that the problem with Zophar is in situations where I'm just content to kind of sit there. Y'all know you can ask everybody else to congratulate you later for having a perfect preacher. Hey, you can do that later. But we got flaws. We got flaws. I got flaws. One of them is I'm still chewing gum. I promised myself I was going to spit the gum out before I got up here. All right, here we go. I've been struggling with that for an hour. Have I been talking for an hour? Here we go. Sorry. Maybe that'll help. But I literally forgot the point. What was I saying? Something. I know nobody knows, right? Good luck with that. All right, it had something to do with, oh yeah, that's it. Zophar. Okay, so when I am in situations where your perfect preacher is just out there kind of living life, keeping up the image of perfection, since nothing affects me. No, you're alive, right? Shelly's back there like, no, it doesn't work that way. All right. I saw that, Shelly. I forgave you. It's a lot easier to forgive me when I'm not picking at you, ain't it? Oh, but let me get to picking at you and all those things that were in the back of your mind about what Marcus is always doing. It was like, are you serious? Are you kidding? That's poor Zophar. There are times in life when we speak third because we're the featured entertainment, for lack of a better term. But there are times in life when we speak third because we might really just not need to speak at all. And so that's one of the things that we're getting to see here. Zophar is not necessarily the one who needs to step up, maybe at all. He might need to be, you ever wanted to be that praying friend in the room where you just show up and pray during the time? Sometimes I just need to be the praying friend. Somebody asked me, they're like, oh, you're not on the program, brother? It was a brother I love. So I was like, thank you. That's good. Another friend, I went back home during the holiday. He was like, I suppose you missed the preaching. I was like, why would you do that? Why would you suppose that? So I was like, if you don't crave that, there's a certain point in life. It's not like I was always like that. I'm just like everybody else. I like pats on the back too. I like to do well. I like applause. But life brings you to certain points where you don't care about it no more. You don't just want a nap. I want a nap. That's what I want more than anything. And the platform is cool. But if there's a time when I can just show up and just be the silent, like I don't even want to be the openly praying preacher. Do I? You had to get my attention. I was ignoring you. Right? No, I wasn't ignoring you. But, I don't like to be up here doing the prayers, right? It's probably obvious today. I was going like, oh, Jesus, thank you for the, one of those count your blessing prayers I offered up this morning. Yeah, exactly. I don't like necessarily do that. I like my prayers to be private. I say whatever's on my mind, right? Yeah. So praying in public it's okay, but I don't have the freedom to basically steal from God like I do right now, right? All I can do is you got to worry about is not messing it up. And so ultimately, when I'm in a situation where I am simply there as the praying brother, I don't have to worry about. On the one hand, there's a lot of joy that goes on when you're happy with it and you get the applause. But on the other hand, when you get to going too far, you get to reminding people of all the things that you are doing wrong when you could otherwise exist in a place of grace. And that is, our brother sung about this morning, there's a passage for communion, talked about this morning, there were subtle notes of grace in there. There's one thing, I've been hammering this whole thing about putting grace in its proper perspective, but grace is an amazing thing. Oh, that's cheesy, I didn't mean to say it that way. But it really is, because there's a sense of peace that comes when I know that I have not overcome, but I still know that my brothers and sisters are still forgiving me. Even though I'm not perfect, they see that I'm trying. And there's still some peace there. And Zophar is bringing himself out of a place of peace. You think they didn't realize, like we said, this is a situation that's not only exposing what's going on in Job, it's exposing what's going on in the friends. You all know that friend in the circle who don't always need to be speaking up, right? Okay, you think it's possible that Zophar might have been that friend before he started talking this time? Right? And it's okay for me. I know I'm that friend. I'm that friend. Why? Because I steal from T.D. Jakes all the time. He says, no matter how talented you are, brother, it's like he's talking to me. It's me. He's having a private conversation with me and a million people. Anyway, you might be in a situation where you feel like you're ready for something else. But you have to realize that you don't necessarily have the standing to speak in some of the rooms that you feel comfortable speaking in. Why? Because sometimes you really do have to have some credibility built up no matter what your answer is, whether it's right or wrong. And that's why we see in Elihu, when he steps up, he speaks after everybody else is silent, and he actually has something to say. And so from that perspective, it's important to understand. Elihu could have stepped up. I'm fourth. Yeah, it's my turn. But he didn't step up fourth. He let everybody finish talking, Job included. And when he stepped up, he had the blessing of hearing round after round after round before he opened his mouth to say a single word. Going back to that thing again, by the time we get to the end, check me on it, be a Berean and all that. Elihu gets passed by in God's rebuke of, or he literally says, offer the sacrifice for your three friends. Elihu wasn't one of them, but Elihu spoke. And so God bless me to, in the time when I have an opportunity to speak, that I not in trying to highlight the faults of others, that I actually end up putting a great big old magnifying glass on the same things that I'm actually doing. Zophar seems to be that friend who people might have, understand, just look at the way Job responds to him. Look at this, look at the sarcasm again. Look, he's not this sarcastic with the others. Like I said, be a Berean, check me out. Verse 2, no doubt you are the people and wisdom will die with you. That's my reading, right? That's my reading, but let's work with it. And then he goes on. verse 3. In case you thought, he was just talking about him generally, it sounds like he's talking about Zophar in verse 3. But I have understanding as well as you, and I'm not inferior to you, who does not know such things as these. And he's literally going to go on and talk about, look, the animals can teach you this, bud. He doesn't just say they can illustrate. He said they can literally teach you, bud. Verse 8, or the bushes of the earth. That's not even an animal. He's like, the vegetation could teach you. And so it doesn't seem like Zophar is walking into the room as the friend with great renown. So understand, there's some times when it's okay to be that way, right? Because Elihu understands that there's a lot I can learn as the young man seated in the room amongst these elders. I don't necessarily have to speak up first, but when I do speak, praise God, let me be ready. I wonder, this is just my guessing, if that young man was praying while all these older men were debating. And maybe one of the reasons why we don't see him get rebuked is in addition to listening, he might have been sending up some petitions for wisdom. Haven't we seen that before? Oh, maybe Solomon did it as he started out, as we mentioned many a time before, as a young king over a great nation. Oh, it wasn't great at the time? Well, David had gotten pretty far. By the time Solomon was done, it was the greatest nation on earth, literally out of the pages of the Bible. Not just Marcus making that up. I make up a lot of stuff. And so it would not be unprecedented for a young man in a time of crisis to offer up a prayer that God answered for wisdom. And that maybe what Elihu did here that Zophar neglected to do in his opportunity to take the stage. Chapter 13, the yous continue. Verse 4, as for you, you whitewash with lies, worthless physicians are you all. Oh, that you would keep silent, and it would be your wisdom. Hear now my argument and listen to the pleadings of my lips. Will you speak falsely for God and speak deceitfully for him? Will you show partiality toward him? Will you plead the case for God? Will it be well with you when he searches you? Or can you deceive as one who deceives a man? He will surely rebuke you. If in secret you show partiality, will not his majesty terrify you? And the dread of him fall on you? Your maxims are proverbs of ashes. Your defenses are defenses of clay. It goes back to something I skipped over from what Zophar said in verse 12. Verse 12 of chapter 11. But a stupid man will get understanding when a wild donkey's colt is born a man. What does that mean? Help me out. My Berean, what does that mean? Exactly. I think Job has hit the point. I remember I said in the short lesson. I used to like this band, this rock band back in the day, and I would sit back, okay, what do their lyrics mean? What do their lyrics mean? What does that mean? And I would go through all these songs, had great guitar lines, excellent drums, and I couldn't make sense of the lyrics until late in the life of the lead singer, we found out he wrote them all on heroin. And I was wasting my time trying to figure out what it didn't mean anything, and then he was high. That was it. And he was high. That was it. And so I think Job, in the course of a few verses, in the midst of all his pain, realizes that this guy ain't high, but he ain't making sense either. And thus, when he says, your maxims, verse 12 of chapter 13, your maxims are the proverbs of ashes, your defenses are the defenses of clay. God, help us have the ability to not wrestle too much on nonsensical things that just flat out don't make sense. And so that's a good thing that we're seeing come out of Job's character, even under pressure. He's still able to cut through to the issue, even when he's at his lowest point. But he has now turned his attention away from having his appeal heard before God to finally get some answers, to trying to just get these friends off of him with these things that they're saying, and it's made worse by the fact, like we said, the whole point about not being too hard on yourself. There are times in life where you're going to find yourself tempted to reply, and don't be too hard on yourself when the situation is such where it's a natural thing to want the truth to come out, especially when it's a refuge for you, right? It's a spiritual discipline to be able to still function and hold your head up when the lies have not been cured yet. And so understand, it puts you in the tough position of feeling like you're wrong for wanting the truth to actually be your vindication. Especially if you've gotten in the habit of telling the truth about the things you do wrong. It doesn't feel fair for me to do all my confessing and then have to live under the burden. I didn't do that part. I've already talked about the part I did. Why would okay, whatever. Right? I'm back there now. I'm sorry. Right? But you got it there too. And you have times where you need to forgive yourself for simply being tempted to tell the truth. You're not wrong for wanting to do that. God is simply saying you've got a heavier weight to lift. Meaning you're never going to be able to defend yourself as good as God can. And that's where the peace comes from, when you let go of the need to defend yourself, even when the lies are still floating and they're a part of the limitations on your reality. Understanding that over and over again, Job is talking about the ways in which you can't get out of a box that God puts you in. You're fighting futilely to try to get out of a space that God just has you in for now. But guess what? It's made even worse in a situation where you know the end is in reach. If I could just say one more thing that can correct the things that they think about me, then I could get out of that one. No, sometimes we're just going to make it worse. And so you have to realize that to a certain degree, the things that you can correct without losing your integrity or your composure or compromising yourself in some other way, it's okay to correct that. But it's also okay to want to correct the things you can't. And just realize that part of my emotional well-being means that I have to be able to move on before it's all settled fairly. And that is where Job's peace of mind can come from, if he can survive this ordeal without having to feel the need to prove himself to his friends. Oh God, please deliver me from the desire to always be able, to always feel the need to have to prove myself to my friends or whoever. Once Job can find the freedom there, I'm convinced he can find the kind of freedom to where he can sit no matter what they say and be like, oh, really, bud? I mean, that's interesting. Oh, sure, what? The wicked? That's me. You're right. Probably. That's why I pray. So it sounds dismissive. But sometimes the sarcasm, you don't have to say it to other people. Sometimes you just say it to yourself. And it'll allow you to restore your smile. Because you get to a point where you realize, I can't convince you, bud. And even if I could, I'm too dumb to figure out how. Because I'm not all that smart. Sometimes I feel smart. But then God brings me back into another situation that reminds me that this is not worth arguing about. And oh, if we could get Job to that point. But can I fault him? No. Because do I know all this if I'm not reading? Was I preaching all this in the days of David? No. I just saw this as we're going through Job. And so Job is helping me get to another level of understanding. These brothers and sisters are passing the baton. Mark, you learned this. Okay, now good. Now you learned that. Now, if Job didn't go through this suffering, I don't necessarily get that lesson. Job's not suffering for his sins. He's suffering so Marcus can be just a little bit less dumb next time he wants to argue and fight. Right? So God willing, I will make use of Job's pain so that God willing, I can be hopefully a vessel for somebody else to understand how it's okay to move on, even if your reputation ain't necessarily where you want it to be. And it's one thing if it's not where you want it to be because you keep feeding into a certain situation. But it's not where I want to be, even though I really have made greater strides in that area than I might be getting credit for. That is where Job is at. Why? Because he hadn't sinned at all, and he's still dealing with it. Guess what? He's kind of a picture of the Christ. And I'm not going to talk about that a whole lot now, but understand how in the last observation I'll try to make, and God willing to leave the sermon with you, Bildad's mistake in a lot of ways was the mistake that all these three friends share in common. They sound like they're in love with God, don't they? Oh, God is so great, Job. How can you understand? Job's like, dude, I already said that. What, really? It's like, oh, God's so great. He's going to see through you, even if you look good to us, Job. Thanks, bud. And you can never be righteous before God, Job, because look, he rebukes even his angels. Did I do good, God? And so that's the way I see it, right? But see, there is no advantage in see, we reach a certain point when we believe in God, we do well. But James literally says, the demons believe and shudder. The belief itself doesn't help me. If all I realize God is being, all I see God as being is a person with the carrot and the stick, right? Because if all I believe God in for is for either the reward, more carrots, God, more carrots, or stick, don't hit me with that one, then we will start to see what Job is starting to expose, not only in Satan, but in his friends. See, now that Job, and it's so important to realize, and I think one of the reasons why, at least for me at this point, I appreciate the fact that God twice himself called Job a blameless man, because as we talked about with the Christ, Job is giving us a picture, a similar picture to what Christ gave us. If this is the way you will treat a blameless man simply because he is no longer in a position of power, what would you do to a God that you look at more as a peer than a power? Oh my goodness. Job is helping us see not only what Satan's like when he has his gloves pulled off, But what my friends are like when they're praising God, but they're beating up on me in a time when I really didn't do it. Oh my goodness. They think they're beating up on Job, but God is looking and saying, he's blameless too. And so while they're trying to expose what Job has done wrong, they're exposing what they really think about God. Oh, wait a minute. Our brother preached the communion talk, gave us a communion talk. We take the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week because we have Jesus who stripped himself of all the power and all the intimidation. Like we said, Revelation chapter, I think it's chapter 6, wherever the sixth seal is open, when the sky is rolled back as a scroll, breaking, talked about it last week. Did I talk about it? I don't know, I talked about it at some point. Breaking the division between the heavenly places and the earthly places. And they get to see, finally, the God they thought would never hold them accountable. It's like, oh, no, there he is. Oh, no, they're seeing him in fear because they're seeing his power. Oh, but he's already been here, bud. No, where was he? Where was he? He was in the form of Jesus. And see, we consider him Jesus now because as Christians, we consider him as a part of God. He's powerful. But they didn't see him that way. No. I talk about it before. I use the Yoda example all the time. I talk about it when I was overseas. It's not just the Yoda example. There are cultures that still function on that principle. When you go to meet the big man will go send you somebody who looks like the big man while he just kind of sits in the corner. He might be sweeping. He might be doing folding laundry. He might be covering some tables. But the person who you really need authority from is the one who's watching you as he sees you treat the other people in the room like whatever you think you can get away with. And so that's what Job is finding out now. Job is helping God, like we say, expose the enemy's positions. He's not only helping Job's not only helping God expose the enemy's positions, because God already knows where the traps are. The traps are beneath him. He cast Satan out of heaven. You don't have to worry about that. He's helping us see where the traps are set. And he's helping us see what we really have. Because understand, we've all had a situation where you loved real hard, but it didn't. And so thank God you finally understood what it was like to love in a way that endures. That's what I love about the lessons I learned from my married folks. But were you batting 1,000? And if you did, you need to write your book. Because there are a lot of us who got out there and dated, and it seemed like this was it. That was, no, this was the one. And your ability to appreciate what you have now comes out of the fact that you had some, no, this was it moments that eventually you pray to God, you're like, oh God, thank you. But it's not all, like we said, it's not always like that. There's sometimes I give flowers out to the people who, I wasn't going to sing it, but who is it, Clint Black? I don't know who it is, country singer. I can't sing it. Why am I going to sing? I just say the lyrics. I'm leaving here a better man for knowing you this way. Things I couldn't do before, now I think I can. But I'm leaving here a better man. It don't always have to end in marriage for a person to improve you, right? It doesn't always have to end that way. And so there are times where, whether it's marriage or not, those situations where you thought it was just going to work out in one way and it didn't. And that is the beauty in the book of Job. Job is finding out what he really had in friends so that he can now, like we said, break relationship with them and never see him again. No. We don't know what their relationship was like after this. There are some times where the only true healing comes in separation. But there are some times when you have the opportunity to take the rose-colored glasses off in looking at what you thought you had in a friend. And now you can begin, as I sometimes say, to rebuild the friendship based upon what you actually got. And so the friends aren't necessarily being exposed here so that they just get rid of them. No, they're being exposed so they can all grow. Like we said, ain't no good guys and bad guys in this story. It's just people struggling to figure out how to work out their relationships. And so to the degree we see in Job and Bildad, people who are struggling with difficult questions, guess what? God's writing a story in us too. And we might see all the answers he gave to Job, but it's some questions I'm struggling to answer too. And if you got them for me, I'll shoot. But if not, I appreciate the prayers too. Which is why we often say, God's best to you as you go forward.